reading it too. I read it. I was like, I was getting ahead of where you're going about the steps. I was going to the end of it. So it was, you like to go for steps.
I was in your class about now 12 years ago. Wow.
Oh, you get it? You know where the LA building is, right? Yeah, like those camels.
No, they actually did not know they Oh yeah, it's the next one.
This is nice. Everything. You gotta call me on this. See what food they find out. See what that's the same one. Students taking one-on-one with someone. That's not how it all is. It's like the
Sweet groups.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, you're fine. We credit St. John's. You just made this case too.
They won't accept it. I'm the chair.
Yeah, I heard you. Right now,
Good, how are you? What? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. What do you see his hairline? It's like Yeah.
Well, I'm still setting it up, so let me do my job, guys. All right.
Okay, I think we are ready to start. So first I want to thank everybody for taking the time and attending this event. I would like to thank GCC for hosting it. And I want to just announce that this event...
Can you speak up a little bit?
Louder?
Thank you.
Okay, louder. Well, this event is live streamed on GCC AZ edu/live, and it's also going to be on YouTube channel, and it is GCC live stream. I would like to first invite the president of GCC to give a few words.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy days and schedules to come and be challenged in an environment outside of the classroom. My name is Dr. Terry Leiva-Reese. I have the great pleasure of serving as the interim president at GCC. This is the start of my second year, and talk about being challenged. You should always look for the opportunities where you are challenged, right? Because that's where you grow. And that's what you will do this afternoon. Coming to college is so much more than earning a degree to get a job, right? Coming to college is about challenging yourself, expanding your comfort zone, and making yourself question the thoughts and ideals that we were raised with, and it's part of our growing and expanding our comfort zone. So I'm really proud of you for being here. You will be challenged today. We have a panel of 5 amazing individuals who will challenge us about God and morality. And I want you to think hard and to maybe jot down some questions that you might have so that you could talk with them afterwards. You will be challenged. You will have a wonderful afternoon, and welcome. We're glad you're here.
I want to reiterate President's call. Please, at the end, don't hesitate to ask questions. The microphone is there. As we get towards the end of the event, line up there and ask questions. Let me point out one important point about questions. You may have questions. This material may be new to you. You might have a question, but you might not be as clear as possible how to express it. Don't worry about it. Express your question. It will be up to the panel to figure out really what you are after. So do not hesitate to ask questions. This event is for you. So we would like you to participate. I would like to first say that for the first time, this event will include 2 members of ASU. I thank both of you, Dr. Owen Anderson from ASU and Dr. Thomas Mononym from ASU. Thank you both for joining us. We also have Dr. Valle from SCC and Richard Klaus, who's a friend of ours for a long time, and he has been on almost every panel here. Thank you, too. I will give a very short introduction, background to the problem, and then we're going to go to the panelists so that everybody is kind of on the same page. The title of this event is God, Morality, and the Euthyphro Challenge. So what's the problem? The problem is about the question of the status of morality. Is morality an objective matter? By objective, I mean independent from our desires, wants, beliefs, opinions. Are there objective standards of morality? Or is morality just a subjective matter? Namely, it depends purely on our interests, preferences, beliefs, desires. This is a huge question that has been with humanity, I believe, all the way to perhaps even the cave. Euthyphro dilemma is a challenge to a particular view that morality is an objective matter. That view is called the divine command theory. And the idea is that if there is an objective morality, it must depend on a divine God's commands. That is the problematic that this panel will be about. So what's the challenge? Briefly put, here's the challenge. Everybody can hear me? Okay, I'm trying to put this in the right angle. So here's the challenge for you. The theist claims that the basis of morality, the objective basis of morality is God's commands. Euthyphro comes and asks the following question. Actually, there are 2 questions, and it's called the dilemma. So there are 2 horns. The first horn is this. Is it the case that something is right because the gods command it, or do the gods command that something is right because it is right? So you notice there are 2 questions here. Each question poses to the theist a serious problem. If the theist picks the second horn and says that the God commands something to be right because it is right, then the rightness is independent from God. Of course, God has knowledge of all the moral standards that determine that thing to be right, but the rightness of anything whatsoever, or the goodness of it, is independent from God. God has no control. God has knowledge, but no control. That is a problem for what is called the sovereignty of God over everything. Everything, according to the theist, must depend on God's will. But according to this horn, morality is independent from God. On the other hand, if you say, or the theist chooses, that something is right because God commands it, then the problem is that morality becomes arbitrary. This is the one that is a little bit hard. So let me try to explain. Prior to God's command, according to this horn, there is no right and wrong. There are no independent standards. So therefore, God could command anything and make it right. So for example, God could, even though maybe God doesn't, but God could command that cruelty is good. But of course that makes no sense. And yet, since there is no independent standard and everything depends on God's will, then God could command that cruelty is good. Now I know you immediately think, how could that be? How can a good God do that? But here's the problem. According to this horn of the dilemma, you can't say that anything is good, including God, prior to God commanding what is right and what is wrong. There is no right and wrong prior to God commanding. There are no independent standards to judge any action by anyone, including God. That's called the arbitrariness problem. So the theist is stuck between the horn that challenges sovereignty of God, because the moral standards are totally independent from God, or the arbitrariness problem. God could command anything, and that would make it right. The panel is going to discuss this problem, and we'll see where it leads. And so now I invite Dr. Valle to start.
Well, I was a hardcore atheist for 15 years. I committed myself to atheism when I was 19, when I was like a lot of you kids. Got really excited about it. I got so excited about it, in fact, that it carried me through a PhD in philosophy. I wrote my dissertation defending atheism. And then when my dissertation got accepted, I realized I really wasn't an atheist anymore. I'm not saying that with any hostility towards atheism, because I think atheism, a good atheist is a good thing. Atheists keep religious people honest and challenge their ideas and so on. And it was this morality thing that played a huge role in my shift, because the whole time I was an atheist, I was always trying to work out, how can I have an objective morality in this accidental universe? I mean, I conceptualized it as accidental. There certainly wasn't any purpose to it. Maybe it came into existence 13.8 billion years ago from nothing for no reason whatsoever, as far as I was concerned. And then you have the evolutionary story, and I understand why animals would cooperate for their mutual self-benefit. But I couldn't understand how you could get anything more than rules that are pragmatically useful for your mutual self-benefit. But I was always convinced that there were moral rules that went above and beyond what's just in my self-interest and mutual cooperation. So to contextualize what's going on here, my belief is I'm not a Christian, although I have no hostility to Christianity. I'm what's called a deist. I vibe with Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Those guys believed in a supreme being who created the universe for a purpose. He infused it with a moral dimension, and there will be an afterlife after we die, so that we can be held accountable for how we behaved. So I accepted all those doctrines. So I am now persuaded that morality does have its foundation in the supreme being. So to contextualize this debate, so as Professor Luper was talking about, so you have objectivism in ethics, which says moral statements have truth values that are independent of human attitudes, feelings, and beliefs. So if I were to say X is right, like helping a person across the street, then it would be right regardless of what people say about it. If the whole world went nuts and decided to stop thinking it was right, it would still be right if objectivism's true. Okay? Then you have relativism, which is X is right, means I, the speaker, approve of X. That's a position called subjectivism or individual relativism. Or X is right means my culture approves of X, which is a position called cultural relativism. And these make moral standards relative to people, and if people change their minds, then the morality will change. I think this characterizes the modern age. I see this a lot on campuses. Then you have the position called nihilism. Nihilism says X is right means nothing. Moral statements don't possess truth values. They're neither true nor false. They don't apply to anything in reality whatsoever. Now, my whole life long, even in my most excitable atheism, I was always an objectivist. I never doubted that there were moral truths in the world. And in objectivism, you have a lot of choices. So just to place this God-based one in there, you have the divine command theory, which says X is right means God commands X. And that's what we're talking about primarily today. You have the natural law theory, which says X is right means X promotes the values specified by the natural inclinations of human beings. Although Dr. Anderson is the expert on natural law theory, so I'll just leave it to him. You have utilitarianism, says X is right means X best promotes pleasure and happiness, net pleasure and happiness in contrast and comparison with all the other alternatives. You have egoism, which says X is right means X best serves my self-interests in comparison with all alternative actions. And you have a lot of these formulas to determine what's right and wrong. And what I would say about the Euthyphro dilemma, the idea with the Euthyphro dilemma is to say that even if God in fact exists, God is not the foundation of morality. Now, I personally I don't have a firm commitment to which objectivist theory of ethics I accept. There's a couple of them, I think, that are in the top 2 or 3 for me. But it really is my view that if there is a supreme being, and I believe that there is, my goodness, what else is going to be the foundation of ethics, for crying out loud? I mean, seriously, the problem with what the atheist is arguing, not always the atheist, okay, but generally, is that if you make morality dependent on God's will, you're going to get an arbitrariness in morality, that morality will have no firm foundation. It's a matter of whim, God's whim. But the thing about it is if objective morality is true, if one of the objectivist theories of morality is true, then you have some objective fact in reality that is the foundation of the rightness of actions. And that foundation has to be bedrock, because if you have a foundation for your ethics that requires another foundation, and this doesn't end, then you have an infinite regress, and essentially you have no real foundation for ethics other than shifting sands. So at some point, you've got to concede, if you're an objectivist in ethics, that there's a bedrock. And my general position is that if God is supposed to be an arbitrary foundation for morality, then what in the world else isn't an arbitrary foundation for morality? I'll give you an example. A utilitarian would say, well, a form of utilitarian would say happiness or maybe preference satisfaction is ultimately that which grounds morality, and it is true that humans objectively do feel pleasures and pains. We can scientifically investigate what creates more pleasure in humans and what creates more pain in humans. Those are objective facts. But what isn't scientifically verifiable is that the amount of happiness and pain produced by my actions has moral relevance. Science doesn't have an answer to that. Science can answer how much pain I'm going to cause. Science can't answer how important the pain is, or how bad, or how morally censurable my action is based on that pain. That's outside of science's realm. So at some point, you're going to reach a bedrock where you say, this is the ultimate foundation of ethics, and beyond this we go no further. And if there really is a God, a supreme being, as I think there is, and if this God is in fact responsible for the creation of everything, including the entire material universe and all the conditions necessary for our existence, I can't imagine what else would be a firmer foundation for morality than the supreme creator being. And the way I visualize it is this. If you believe in objective ethics, you have to believe that there's some good, something called the good. This reminds me of Plato's theory of the forms. He says there's a form of the good. And I tend to agree with Plato. I actually think he's right. There is something that's the good. People try to identify what the good is. And the way I view the foundation of morality is it's not that God, the supreme being, is referencing some good that's separate and independent from him. It's that God and the good are identical. And that the ethical obligations that come from God are not an arbitrary decision on God's part. They are actually merely an expression of the good through that which is the good. If God were to tell me don't murder, I would have the confidence that that's not an arbitrary decision. That's just an outflowing or an expression of the good which God embodies. Now, as a classical deist, I'm not inclined to believe people when they said they were talking to God. I'm not personally. I mean, I'm not offended if you believe people were talking to God. I tend not to believe that myself. But whatever the correct theory of ethics is, I do believe that its ultimate foundation is going to be found in the good of the Supreme Being. And so that would be my case, is that if this Euthyphro dilemma successfully destroys a God-based morality or any theory of morality that is based on a supreme being, it's going to undermine any other objectivist theory as well, because there's no other objectivist theory that can give you any kind of a bedrock that's firmer than the bedrock of the creator of everything. So my ultimate conclusion over the years has been that I adopted a belief in a supreme being, and that the supreme being was the foundation of the good. It was the good and expressed the good. Thank you.
Dr. Anderson now.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm over from ASU West, so it's just kind of up the road. And some of you may end up taking philosophy classes over there, so you can look me up. And I'm going to talk about the same thing, Euthyphro dilemma. Let me give a little bit of context to the Euthyphro dilemma. What's happening in this? You can Google this. MIT has a website that has all these classical texts there for free, so you can look this up and you can read it. It's very entertaining. I encourage you to do so. Socrates is waiting to go on trial. He's a philosopher, and he's committed some offenses against the state. Can you imagine philosophers doing that? When you think of philosopher, do you think of federal criminal? So he's waiting for his trial to begin, and there's another guy in the waiting room also waiting for a trial to begin, and so Socrates starts up a conversation with him. And this other guy, Euthyphro, is there because he's bringing his father to justice. And this raises a question, what are the demands of justice? Does filial piety, does love of your father trump the civil law? Would you bring your father to court, or would you protect your father? Which one's the higher of the two demands on our virtues? So that's the context. They're talking about this, and Socrates is interested in Euthyphro because he says he's very pious. He says it himself. That's something I don't hear a lot of students bragging about anymore. I listen as I go around campus and listen to what they brag about. They don't often brag about being pious. Do you know what piety is? Yeah? Well, that's what Socrates asks. Well, what is pious? He's very proud of being pious. What is piety? How do you know if you're pious or not? So the discussion that happens, as in many cases with Socrates, is that a number of the speaker's intuitions come out in the discussion. And so this discussion, the dilemma that Peter and Mike put out there, for Socrates and Euthyphro is a dilemma that comes up in the context of polytheism. So I'm going to suggest, I have 5 points. My first point is that this dilemma depends on the context you're operating within, your worldview context and your presuppositions. For these two, they're polytheists, and so they quickly get into a problem of what God do you follow? The gods disagree. The gods argue. Hera and Zeus are on different sides of the Trojan War. So if they disagree about what is good, how do you know which of them is superior? So polytheism will give you one part of the problem. Then there is dualism. Mike was talking about Plato, and Plato and Aristotle, Plato's Socrates' student, these are Greek dualists. They aren't polytheists. They believe that God and the material world have coexisted from eternity. They're both eternal. They deny the idea of God, the creator. And then there are theists, those who, like Thomas Jefferson, Christians, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are theistic religions who affirm God, the creator. The material world has not existed co-eternally with God. So the first point is just that when we enter into this discussion, as you're listening to people talk about it, you need to try to figure out which of these worldviews are they operating within. Because our intuitions are shaped by our presuppositions. So for Socrates and Euthyphro, they have very naturally intuitions that have to do with polytheism. And they naturally start discussing what Zeus did to his father. Zeus did not show filial piety to his father. And so Euthyphro says, I don't need to show that to my father on the model of Zeus. So their intuitions come out in that context. The second point is that the particular problem for them within polytheism is, as Mike said, it reduces the good to an appetite. What do you approve of? A desire. Zeus desires one thing, Hera desires something else, Apollos desires a third thing. And so you get into this problem of, is something good because I desire it, or do I desire it because it's good? Socrates uses the analogy of getting carried. Is something getting carried, or is it being carried because it gets carried? And how do we think about the action of these kinds of verbs? But again, in the context of the finite deities they're talking about, it depends on their circumstances and what they want and desire. So a particular problem, can we reduce good to an appetite or a desire? Sometimes it's called emotivism. Alternatives are intellectualism, which is the good has to do with believing true things about the world, or voluntarism, that the good has to do with the will. Usually one of these three will find intellect, emotion, or will trying to be what I might call the bedrock of an ethical theory. And so in the Euthyphro dilemma, the special focus is on the desires of the gods. What do they desire? So that's the second point for the polytheists. The third point, for Plato and Aristotle as Greek dualists, for them, God is forming the world at best out of material that exists with God from eternity. So he doesn't, Peter used the word sovereignty. God does not have divine sovereignty. So when you read Plato or Aristotle and you see the word translated God, you get excited, oh, these guys believed in God, kind of like Moses. No, this is a very different conception of God. This is God co-eternal with matter, maybe the demiurge, or what you call the unmoved mover, if you've heard of this. For Aristotle, God is unmoved by the world. He moves things by being perfect, and things move towards that excellence or towards that perfection, but God himself is unaware of the world. He's involved in perfect self-contemplation. He doesn't know of anything else besides himself. So in Plato and Aristotle, this problem will come out very differently, and the object, the good, and God as being come out as, and Plato expressed them as the same thing, but they're really two different categories. We're asking about what is good. How do humans possess this thing? How do they get it? Like if you want a paycheck, you want to get your paycheck from your boss, right? So we don't get God in the way that we get a paycheck and put it in our pocket, have God with us. Instead, we get God by participating in the divine knowledge and knowing about who God is. And so we distinguish between God and knowing who God is. And that's the fourth point in theism. So you have the context for Socrates and Euthyphro, then the problem for a polytheist, the problem for a dualist, and fourth point, the problem for the theist. In theism, we have only God is eternal. Only God has existed from eternity. God determines the good for something by creating its nature. So the good is according to the nature of a thing. What is good for a human depends on what it is to be a human. What is good for a horse depends on what it is to be a horse. What is good for a car depends on what it is to be a car. You can keep going, right? Can you imagine taking your horse in for an oil change every 3,000 miles? Or neglecting to do so for your car because your horse doesn't need that? So when we speak about the good of something, there's sometimes the divine command theory says something's good because God says so. We have this middle term, the nature of a thing. What is it to be that thing? So that God does determine the good, but he does it through making the thing of a certain kind. Say a human is a rational being, and so knowledge is particularly good for rational beings. And then the fifth point, finally, back to this idea of piety. Euthyphro says he's pious. If you've read Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas likes to go around saying the same thing. Sum pius Aeneas. I am pious Aeneas. But it's not really a phrase we say anymore, is it? I am pious Anderson. Could have that on my office door. I love God. I do what God says. The idea is if God commands it, I do it. Jupiter said, found Rome, I do that, no matter what other personal demands are on me. Well, in order to do this, we'd have to distinguish God from not God. If you love God, you'd need to know what God is and what isn't God. Does that seem like a fair place to begin? Can you imagine that on a Valentine's Day card? You're not quite sure who you love. I love you, but I don't know who you are or what your nature is. On a Valentine's Day card, they want you to be very specific. Not only do you have two eyes, they're the best eyes ever, right? Not only do you have hair, it's the best hair ever, right? So to love God would be able to know God, to know what makes God distinct from not God. That would be the first step. And this will require us to be able to work our way through, are we polytheists, are we dualists, or are we theists? Is God a finite created being who has some greater power than us, but ultimately can be destroyed? Is God co-eternal with the material world, or is God the creator? And that's the end. That's my 10 minutes. All right. Hope you have some good questions.
Right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here. My name is Mononym, and I am a colleague of Dr. Anderson, also at ASU West. And as said before, I'm glad to see so many people here, including some of my students. It's amazing what bribery can achieve. That said, I know if you need to leave, the signing sheets are here. All right. So the Euthyphro challenge. We've heard what the challenge is. If God commands something to be done, does that make it good because God commands it, or conversely, does God command you to do something because it is good independently? The problems with respectively with arbitrariness and sovereignty. I'm not going to take on the problem really head on, but I have some other considerations to bring up. Starting with the background, we need to assess the question. Because for us, the question of, well, if God commanded us to do immoral acts, instead of love thy neighbor, what about hurt thy neighbor? You may have heard of the Wicked Bible. It's a Bible manuscript that misses one crucial word in Exodus 20:14, so that it reads, "Thou shalt commit adultery." What if that got it right? But for us to even entertain this question, we need to have an existing notion of morality. We need to know, we need to have an understanding of what it is to be moral, what it is to be immoral, before we can fully explore this question. Excuse me. So, what are some of the alternatives? Maybe morality is imprinted in us through God. But it doesn't take much to see the problem with that particular view. And John Locke raised the problem, here he says in his own words, "Whether there be any such moral principles wherein all men do agree, I appeal to any who have been but moderately conversant in the history of mankind and looked abroad beyond the smoke of their own chimneys. Locke's argument is that if we claim that morality is something innate in us, that won't do. There is not enough agreement to be able to say that, oh, morality is innate, but your moral code is different from mine. That would invite a further explanation. All right. Well, if God is the source of morality, maybe God conveys the moral truth, the moral commandments, us through an intermediary. That has been a popular throughout human history. Excuse me. But this one is also problematic. How so? Well, Thomas Hobbes points out that people are naturally superstitious and have these ideas of, or have the desire for explanations. And Hobbes points out that this is an extremely easy for someone to usurp and to take advantage of. What if the person who claims to be the prophet of God is just laying out these rules for the purpose of advancing their own agenda? So now you would have to be able to tell the real commandments from the fake ones. Okay. To the earlier suggestion of, well, where does objective morality come from, I would like to add one item to the list. Goes by the name of social contract theory. And here's the basic idea, or maybe the worst case scenario. Let's start with the assumption that everyone is rational and everyone is self-interested. Rational in the sense that people can figure out what are the most conducive ways for advancing their cause, for satisfying their interests. How do you get morality out of a situation like that? Well, Thomas Hobbes has a few things to say in the book Leviathan. And his argument is aimed to show that even such individuals, egoistic through and through, would discover that morality, understood as constraints on your behavior, that's the best alternative. All right. And this answer has some affinity to the answer that Immanuel Kant gives, but I'm not going there. All right. So now the question becomes, in terms of objective morality, the phrase often ascribed to one Ivan Karamazov from Dostoevsky's famous book. Without God, there is nothing, or without God, anything is permissible. I would like to modify that a little bit in light of the social contract theory, so that it says that without society, anything is permissible. Hobbes gives a very vivid description of what happens when there are no rules in society, when people exist in what he terms the state of nature, where the life of a human is nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, now social contract theory has its critics. I'm not going to give you a full-blown answer here. I don't think I can do it in 10 minutes. But one of the detractors of social contract theory, David Hume, he talks about two different kinds of moral sentiments. First, which he says could exist even without societies, but those are fairly limited in scope. What does he identify them as such? Moral duties, those to which men are impelled by a natural instinct of this nature, are love of children, gratitude to benefactors, pity to the unfortunate. So even in the state of nature, according to Hume, you could find these. Something more advanced, what he terms the second kind, and here in his words again, second kind of moral duties are such as are not supported by any original instinct of nature, but are performed entirely from a sense of obligation, when we consider the necessities of human society and the impossibility of supporting it if these duties were neglected. Thus is justice, fidelity, observance of promises obligatory, and so on. So the social contract theory seems to be able to account for the second kind of duties. What about the first kind? Well, like I said, I do not have a full-blown answer here, because that would take us little beyond our schedule. But I would suggest looking into reciprocal altruism as a potential source. Being altruistic to others in an expectation of receiving something in return. And there's been plenty of research done on this topic in the even by philosophers of biology. All right. Does this give us objective morality? Well, we can try to sort it out in the discussion with the questions. Thank you.
Two things. It is dark up here. I'm about to fall asleep. Not because of the talks. They've kept me awake. The other thing I was thinking as I was reflecting upon these environments, the third time I've been invited to do this, so thank you, Peter. Thank you, GCC. I think it's always great to model civil discourse about that which matters most. We need that in our political discourse. So if we can model something here, perhaps that's a start. But I was reflecting upon, wouldn't it be great if we all had walk-up music? You know, have you noticed that? You know, I was reflecting upon that and began to think, has anybody used the word Euthyphro in lyrics? And so this wonderful friend of mine, Google, I checked with him or her, and there's actually a death metal band that was formed 19 years ago today, by chance, and they used the word Euthyphro in their lyrics. I won't say the lyrics because the rest of them are pretty blasphemous and disturbing. And I'll tell you, I must be middle-aged because I could not understand any of the words. I had the lyrics in front of me, so I knew what they were saying, but it sounded like a lot of growling. But Euthyphro has actually made it into at least some death metal. Every one of us has a worldview. You brought one in with you, whether you realize it or not. If I were to ask you if you're religious, we'd have some hands go up, some hands stay down. But everybody has a worldview, with it composed of at least three items. They're metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And even if you don't know what those words are, you have it. Sort of like epidermis when you learn as a kid, I have an epidermis. No, it's okay. It's not a disease. We all think about things about reality. What's ultimate reality? Is it simply material? Is there a supernatural realm in terms of our metaphysics? Our epistemology, how we come to know things, and our ethics. What do we think is right and wrong? And how do we ground that morality, which is what we're talking about today? So what happens when worldviews come into conflict or conversation, as hopefully is happening today? I think at least three things happen. And this happens all the time. We engage in proof, defense, and offense. And by proof, I mean we attempt to give reasons and evidence for why we believe the things we believe. We have to give then a defense for objections that are raised for things that we believe in. And of course, then we have to then sometimes go on the offense, not to be offensive in some sort of mean sense, but to go on the offense and look at the other worldview and critically probe it for inconsistencies. This is nothing new. You've done this before. If you've ever had a late night when you're wondering about what's the best movie of all time, and somebody says, I think the original Star Wars, somebody says Rocky III, and you think, why would you choose those two examples? They're just random. You know, somebody's going to say, I'm going to give positive reasons for why I think. I'm going to try to answer objections, and I'm also going to try to undermine what I think is your best thing. So we do this all the time, and we do this with our worldviews. And so it's been mentioned, Euthyphro is a challenge, I think, for us all about the basis of morality and justifying morality, the basis of it. Every worldview faces the challenge of moral value. If you take nothing away from my talk today, I hope that'd be the challenge for you to wrestle with this issue for your worldview. Not just in terms of putting things in cubby holes as who's a deist, who's a Christian. We face the challenge of moral value, defining its nature, explaining its basis or its grounding or lack thereof. And so my presentation, very briefly, is to want to go on the offense. As a Christian, usually I'm on the receiving end of the Euthyphro, and I know we will be. I know some of Peter's presentation that's coming. That, to challenge, our conception of God, whether it's coherent. But I want to actually go on the offensive and take that third thing of going on the offense and looking at naturalism. Can naturalism provide the preconditions of intelligibility for moral value, particularly moral realism? Naturalism can be difficult to actually define. Many naturalists disagree about how to define it. I'm going to use a definition by Kai Nielsen, who is an atheist. He says this: naturalism denies that there are any spiritual or supernatural realities transcendent to the world, or at least we have no good ground for believing that there could be such realities. It is a view that anything that exists is ultimately composed of physical components. And by all accounts, naturalism is the reigning philosophy in higher education today. It is the background belief, the atmosphere in which studies are conducted. So how are naturalism and moral realism related? I want to argue that naturalism does not comport well or fit well with moral realism. What's moral realism? We've heard a little bit about it. That objective moral values exist. They are discovered, not created. They're not subjective. These moral values are valid and binding whether anybody believes in them or not. They still have a binding value. Many times atheists and naturalists have recognized that there is this disconnect between naturalism or atheism and moral realism. Jean-Paul Sartre says, the existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. And Friedrich Nietzsche has written, there are altogether no moral facts. Indeed, morality has truth only if God is the truth. It stands or falls with faith in God. But it's not just philosophers of previous generations, but of our own time. Tamler Summers and Alex Rosenberg have written an interesting article recently called Darwin's Nihilistic Idea, Evolution and the Meaninglessness of Life. They write in that article, Darwinism thus puts the capstone on a process which since Newton's time has driven teleology is purpose, teleology to the explanatory sidelines. In short, it has made Darwinians into metaphysical nihilists, denying that there is any meaning or purpose to the universe, its contents, its cosmic history. But in making Darwinians into metaphysical nihilists, the solvent algorithm, which is simply their way of saying the random variation acted on by natural selection, which is what we normally just summarize as natural selection, this solvent algorithm should have made them into ethical nihilists too. For intrinsic values and obligations make sense only against the background of purposes, goals, and ends which are not merely instrumental. They later add that morality is at most instrumentally a useful illusion. They say that this evolutionary account of ethical beliefs is a universal acid, which is Daniel Dennett's phrase, and the result is moral nihilism. Any evolutionary account of moral belief will not only explain ethics, but will explain it away. This leads Christian philosopher Mitch Stokes to conclude, if naturalism is true, there's no morality apart from what humans value, want, or prefer. Morality is purely a matter of taste. In short, naturalism implies moral nihilism, the view that there are no human independent moral rules. Well, how can the naturalists respond to this charge of moral nihilism? They can simply, number one, accept moral nihilism. Okay, if that's what it entails, then we're moral nihilists. Let's embrace this and live with it. But this has problems. It seems to violate our fundamental moral intuitions. There are bedrock moral facts that we know. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. It's not just a social convention. It's not reducible simply to taste, like I like vanilla ice cream, but you like strawberry. One has written, like sense perception, we have certain moral intuitions or instincts that are basic to properly functioning humans. If we don't have them, something's wrong with us. You might meet somebody that says, well, I don't have that intuition. Well, that's like saying, well, somebody says, I can't see the painting because I'm blind. There's something wrong with your intuitions. Accepting moral nihilism also leads to the loss of an objective basis for human rights, for those who are interested in such an endeavor or elements of social justice. We lose the objective basis for condemning morally abhorrent people and practices. Think of Hitler, bin Laden, or add to your list, rape and torture. We lose the objective basis for moral motivation. For someone can say, why uphold some arbitrarily chosen moral standard, especially if such a standard puts unwanted restrictions on me. The other option a naturalist might try is to reject moral nihilism and attempt to ground moral realism on a naturalistic basis. And some attempt to ground moral realism in naturalism, such as giving evolutionary accounts, which we heard just a little bit about. This seems to be there's been different ways of doing this. Stuart Kauffman is one philosopher. In his book, Reinventing the Sacred, he attempts to do this. He attempts to show how this can happen. He mentions an experiment done with two monkeys. One is fully fed, and there's a partition between the two monkeys. The other monkey is not fed at all, given scraps. And there's a third monkey that sees the two monkeys. And he's fully fed and has extra food. And what does that monkey do? Well, he ends up sharing his food with the monkey that was only given scraps. And then Kauffman looks at this and says, well, look, this shows these monkeys have evolved a sense of fairness. Look, evolution can evolve this sense of fairness. And yet the problem is that Kauffman begs the question in the way he describes the language he uses to set this up. One person has written two questions will illustrate the fallacy. Number one, is fairness ethical simply because monkeys evolved it? Or, number two, did monkeys evolve towards an ethical standard that is independent of themselves? Sort of now a monkey-like Euthyphro argument developed here. It can't be the second object. There's an independent standard, because that would be too much like some sort of transcendental source, like theism or something, or deism. But it can't be number one, because if you want to say that simply these fairness ethical, it's ethical simply because they evolved it, well, animals have evolved all sorts of other behaviors. Some lions collect harems. Does this justify polygamy? Some animals cannibalize their young. Does this justify infanticide as we look there? Also, some other problems that it only deals with the context, doesn't even deal with motivations and intentions. We don't know what the motivations and intentions of the monkeys were. I'm going to skip ahead, because I was told 20 minutes, so I'm taking my 20. Kauffman concedes that his arguments are insufficient. He says, still, ethical and moral reasoning goes far beyond what can be accounted for by evolutionary arguments. At the end of the day, end of his book, he recognizes this. Sam Harris is another one who attempts to have a naturalistic basis for objective morality. I brought up some of these themes last year in brief, and afterwards somebody pointed me, well, Sam Harris, he grounds an objective value in atheism. I don't believe he does. I think Sam Harris's view is basically a view of utilitarianism. It's a sophisticated view, but he eventually tries to ground objective value in scientifically demonstrated states of well-being. He says we can do MRI brain states, and we can know the pain states. If you stick somebody, a certain part of your brain flashes, and that's an objective reality. Well, that is an objective reality, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about moral good. Matter of fact, the problem for Sam Harris is that he reduces moral value to prudential value. Prudential goods are good for a subject. It's good to brush your teeth. Why? Well, because your teeth won't fall out, you won't have pain. But moral goods are moral good, period. There's an objectiveness about them. In fact, one author says, in other words, Harris seems to be in danger of changing the subject and not giving us a theory of morality at all. At the end of the day, Harris is not really talking about moral values. He's just talking about what's conducive to the flourishing of sentient life on this planet. A number of other problems with his view as well. A third one, Eric Wielenberg's non-theistic moral realism has been brought up. That this is a non-theistic way to ground moral realism. The ethicist Paul Capon summarizes Wielenberg's view this way. The atheist Eric Wielenberg claims that objective morality's foundation consists of certain brute ethical facts. Brute ethical, they're simply there. They have no explanation outside themselves, no further facts make them true, and we can know these brute ethical facts immediately without inferring them from other known facts. Necessary moral truths didn't evolve with humanity, but are part of the furniture of the universe. They're there. They constitute the ethical background of every possible universe, creating the framework for assessing actions of any moral agents. What are the problems here? The problem here, I think, is an arbitrary and unwarranted assumption that objective value has emerged from valuelessness. Wielenberg writes, he says, I offer my slogan, from valuelessness, from a state of no value, value sometimes comes. Paul Capon has written, but to assert this, so that sometimes a valueless state can all of a sudden just pop into existence value, to assert that is not to justify it, and this claim hangs on a mere metaphysical wish that maybe value could emerge from valueless matter. The claim is not anchored in ontological realities. There's also the problem, it's a massive coincidence. This view rests upon just a lucky coincidence, sometimes called the lucky coincidence objection. Earlier, Wielenberg admitted that if there is no God, that in some sense it's an accident that we have the moral properties that we do. He says his view undoubtedly entails that certain elements of the universe, the actual laws of nature and basic ethical facts, fit together in a nifty and perhaps amazing way. Hey, isn't it amazing that this algorithm, this natural selection, has simply produced beings of such a quality that can now not only recognize these brute ethical facts that are there, and are now obligated to them. The non-naturalistic moral realist in this case holds that A, certain necessary moral facts exist, as brute givens, and that self-reflective, morally responsible, and intrinsically valuable beings, that's us, eventually appear on the scene through unguided, highly contingent evolutionary steps who both can recognize these pre-existing facts and are duty-bound to them. Not only, so there's this issue of having a consciousness that can recognize these things, and now we also have to recognize that I have a duty to them. This Platonic-like moral realm, it appears, was anticipating our emergence, just waiting for us to comply with it, a remarkably cosmic accident. And Paul Capon adds, a far simpler, less ad hoc explanation is available, however. A good personal God, the very locus of objective moral values, created human beings with dignity and worth. Moral facthood and moral worth have always existed since both applied to God before his creation of human beings. Theism affords a more elegant and natural explanation. What I've attempted to show in a quick manner, and it's been quick, is that naturalism cannot provide the preconditions of moral realism. I would argue in contrast, although I won't take the time now because I am going to stop at 20 minutes, is that, in contrast, Christian theism does provide a worldview that more readily comports with moral realism. God is the standard of moral value. He himself is the good. God's commands then provide a basis for our moral duties of that which is right and wrong. And God, as a personal agent, is a righteous judge who ensures moral accountability. Evil will be punished appropriately and justice vindicated. My primary goal is to be on the offense, to critically probe the internal consistency of naturalism as a foundation and its foundation for moral realism. This doesn't prove Christian theism. Someone say, you didn't prove. No, I was obviously engaged in one aspect of that proof, defense, offense, going on the offense. But it does provide, I hope, a ground-clearing function so that a fresh hearing for Christian theism and its philosophical resources for undergirding moralism may be heard, and that is what I would commend to you today.
So I want to announce to you that the inevitable sometimes happens, and the inevitable happened. The inevitable is that people surprise you. And they did. Virtually nobody in this panel who wanted to defend theism against Euthyphro really pressed the view I expected. So I'm going to have to adjust my talk a little bit, and I'm going to sort of relate some of the issues that were actually discussed and evaluate them and then sort of kind of lead towards what my view is. Euthyphro is the first challenge to the idea that morality can be explained in other terms. It is a challenge to the idea that any God, any person-like being, one God, many gods, 2, 3, doesn't matter what, can explain morality. That's Euthyphro's challenge. Now, I'm going to relate this idea of what Euthyphro is all about to some of the comments that our panelists made, and then I will tell you what the ramifications are. So first, Mike. Hi, Mike. So Mike suggested that when you ask what is the basis of morality, there has to be somewhere where explanations stop. You can't have an infinite regress, right? Morality is based on this, and then this is based on that. Why morality is based on this? Because of that. Eventually, you have to stop and say, this is the foundation. This is the end. We can't keep going. I agree. The question is where we stop, and I would like to make a distinction between two different kind of questions. One question is question why. So for example, we can ask, well, why this is moral? Well, it is moral because, let's say, God says so. But why God saying so is moral? Because, and then you go on. Well, you got to stop somewhere. I agree. So why questions have to end somewhere. But that doesn't mean that what questions cannot be asked even at the place where we stop. So the infinite regress problem is not a problem. You can say that we can stop the infinite regress of why questions at some point, wherever you want to stop it, but that doesn't mean that we can't ask what questions about the stopping point. So that's first. Second, Mike suggested that God is good. In other words, God is in some sense identical to the property of being good. Well, what does this mean? If God is a person-like being, an individual thing, an individual object, then saying that God is good doesn't make sense, because good is not an individual thing. So therefore, Mike must say that God is good, namely has the property of being good. But of course, that's exactly the question that Euthyphro attacks. So if Mike wants to say that God is good, God, in the sense of identity, God cannot be a person-like being. God must be some sort of like a collection of properties, characteristics. And that won't be a person-like being. And actually, on Tuesday and Thursday, I agree with that. Because on Tuesday and Thursday, I'm a theist. Don't ask me Monday, because Monday I'm an atheist. So, this is my comment about Mike's view. Let me point out, emphasize, I may agree with Mike about the identity, provided God is not taken as a person-like being. That theme is going to continue going through all my presentation. Because my presentation is that Euthyphro shows that God cannot be a person-like being in order to ground morality. Now let's go to Owen. Owen argued that polytheism, dualists, and theists all attempt to ground morality. All Euthyphro applies to all of them for different reasons. Notice that according to all three, polytheist, dualist, and theist, deity is taken to be person-like, except in one case there are many, other cases there may be two or one. Euthyphro will apply to all these cases. But I would like to talk a little bit about Owen's positive idea. Owen's positive idea is that to avoid Euthyphro, what we need to say is that God creates everything with a nature, and that nature is good. So if I understand correctly, for example, God created us with rationality, and rationality, therefore, is good for us. That's the view? Am I right about roughly stating your view?
Or what is good is what is to act according to your nature.
Yeah. So it's going to be good to act in accordance with rationality for us. So that appears to kind of slide around Euthyphro. But actually, I suggest it doesn't. Because we can now ask the Euthyphro question regarding this proposal in the following way. Is rationality good because God created us rational beings? Or is God creating us rational being is good because rationality is good? And we have the same problem, exactly as the original Euthyphro. Is it the case that rationality is good quite independently of whether God created us rational or not? If that's the case, then God created us rational is going to be good because rationality is good. Or is rationality good because God created us rational? And we have the same problem all over again. So I don't think that we can escape Euthyphro as long as we are talking about a person like God. Now, let's see if we can escape it if we don't talk about a person like God. How about Thomas' suggestion about a society? Social contract. Can we ground the good on a social contract? I don't think so. Why? Because we can talk about good or bad social contracts, right? And as long as we can say that some social contracts are good and some are bad, we can't ground the good on social contracts alone. So I don't see how social contract theory can ground the good. And there is another problem. Social contract theory, of course, establishes that the central concept here is contracts. But the good cannot be based on contracts because we can ask whether breaking a contract, let's say the social contract, is good or bad. And if we can ask that, then surely the good is independent from the social contract that is supposedly the foundation. Now we can go to Richard. I agree with almost everything Richard said. Because I don't think that the good can be reduced to any natural phenomena. I think natural phenomena may be evidence of where is the good and where is not. But it cannot be reduced. We cannot say the good is what is desirable. The good is what brings the most pleasure. Because every time we can also ask, but is it good to maximize pleasure? Is it good to do what is desirable? And if we can ask this question, that suggests that the good and desirable, the good and pleasure, and the good at whatever else you put there is going to be an open question. For those who know a little bit moral theory, this alludes to Moore's open question argument. So what we have here is that I think that Richard's review of all kinds of natural attempts to ground the good on natural phenomena, he's right. It can be done. But it also can be done to claim that the good is somehow held or determined by God as the standard, the moral standard of good. Why can't it be done? Well, I'm not sure exactly how Richard or anyone else intended this, but let me tell you about how the most influential answers to Euthyphro in the literature, how they went along. The idea is this. People said, look, God is by nature good. Therefore, of course, God would issue commands that are good. Therefore, God cannot issue commands that are evil. Therefore, there is no arbitrariness. So the horn that allegedly creates the arbitrariness situation or challenge to the theist doesn't exist because there is a third option. The third option is God is by nature good and therefore cannot issue evil commands. I don't know whether Richard intended to go in that direction when he said God is the standard, but there is a problem here. There are two ways to understand what it means to say that God is good by nature. One is simply to say that God has characteristics, traits. For example, God is maximally loving and caring. And these characteristics are good. And then we can say that's why God is good, by nature. Of course, there's a problem, as you can perhaps guess. We can now ask, is it the case that lovingness and caringness maximally is good because God has it, these characteristics? Or the fact that God has them and that's why God is good is because lovingness and caringness are good characteristics. And we have Euthyphro all over again regarding the characteristics. God is good because God has these characteristics of lovingness and caringness, and these are good characteristics, therefore that is independent from God. Or is lovingness and caringness a good characteristic because God has them? And we are back to Euthyphro. You can have a slightly different way of thinking about it and saying, no, what Richard meant is God is the exemplar of good. What does that mean, to be the exemplar of good? Is to be the example, the paradigm case, the sort of standard barrier of good. But now we can ask, why is God the standard barrier of good? And the answer that Richard might give, or other theists might give, is, well, because that is what the standard is. Let me give you an example of a similar idea. There is a length called meter. The meter length is determined by a particular stick. That's how it's originally was decided. A particular stick that is actually in a vault in Paris. So a meter is that length of that stick. Whatever that length is. It doesn't matter. That's the standard for what a meter is. Now, if that stick, let's say, would have been longer at the time that was decided, then that length would have been a meter. If it would have been shorter, then that length would have been the standard for a meter. And the length of the meter would have been that. So the problem we have here is to say that God is the standard of good doesn't say much unless we have a prior conception, independent conception, what is good. And then we can say God exemplifies it for us. But the reason God is good is because God satisfies or behaves according to that standard. But that is something the theist cannot say. So what is left is God is the standard of good, whatever that is. Just like the case of this standard meter. And that, of course, would mean that if God would have been evil, that would have been good. And we are back to the arbitrariness objection. So what we have in Richard's case is either we're talking about a natural property that makes God good, but then we can ask you, the Euthyphro question about that property. Is God good because God has these properties and these properties are good? Or are these properties good because God has them? And then we are back to the arbitrariness or the independence problem. Or we take the standard sort of paradigmatic case, but that is decided by convention. We don't have a prior standard, so therefore we just simply say God is good means God does whatever God does. And then we have to accept that as good. So, to sum up, I don't know if I'm over time or not. Maybe you guys know. But hey, the truth matters. I think that Euthyphro was the first challenge to the idea that morality can be reduced to something else. In this particular case, it was a challenge to the idea that morality can be reduced to any person-like being, regardless of that, what it is. Deity, one God, two gods, many gods. Subsequently, other challenges were presented to any attempt to reduce morality to other realms, natural phenomena and so forth. So, what should we learn from this? What we should learn is that morality is an autonomous enterprise. It may be related to other areas in the sense of other areas can be evidence for it, but we can't simply reduce morality to something else. And that provides some challenge. Just like, for example, I believe we can't reduce mathematics to something else, even though other areas can be evidence for mathematical truths. And that provides a challenge, because we tend to want to reduce difficult questions to simpler ones. Complex stuff to more simple ones. And when we can't, we kind of don't know what to do. But in this case, we just have to live with it. Thank you. Please sign up for questions right there. And do not hesitate to ask questions. Everybody who wants to ask a question, please line up there and ask questions. The panelists can't wait.
Am I in the right spot?
By the way, you guys know how to operate this?
Oh, yeah, this is working.
What? It's weaponized already?
Am I confused here?
Okay, go ahead.
Victor, you want to lead us off? Victor, you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Please.
Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the context of the Euthyphro dilemma. How it arises in whose philosophy, right? I mean, in what? Well, it's Socrates. Okay, so which is his product is Plato, right? I mean, his Plato's philosophy. And when I think of the Euthyphro in the context of Plato's actual philosophy, what I come up with is he's claiming that the mere command from some powerful deity or any powerful being is too weak a foundation for morality. It's actually too weak. You need, and where does Plato end up? He ends up with with a form of the good, right? And then Christian theology comes along later, and I think kind of brings the form of the good into theism, all right, into its version of theism. But I want to suggest that modern people, I think, look at the Euthyphro dilemma as a way of not having to have a metaphysical basis for ethics at all. We simply have our social interests. These provide whatever standard foundation for morality there is. That's all there is, because everything else gets the Euthyphro dilemma, right? But I think that's not what's going on. I think what Socrates and Plato are doing, they're pushing for a stronger moral foundation than what just saying, well, it's Apollo says or Zeus says or whatever. It's got to be stronger than that, right? But it seems to me that modernists turn around and say, no, it has to be weaker than that. Any reactions to that? I mean, it's...
Yeah, I think you're right. The idea that there needs to be some kind of metaphysical relationship between ethical claims and what kinds of things exist. So maybe Richard's was addressing that in pointing out that if only material things exist, then we can't justify the truth of value statements. I don't think that the circle arises in recognizing those different areas. That's what I was trying to point out, was the difference between ontology, which is about being, and ethics, which is about value. Those can be related to each other, but doing the Euthyphro circle continuously, well, is that good because you say it's good, or you say it's good because it's good? This is just staying within the ethical area. We can then ground things in what kinds of things must exist in order for there to be something to be good at all.
And what's more than that is that the people ask the question, can there be ethics without God? Well, there are a lot of ethical systems that don't have a God, but they have a form of the good or an inherent purpose for human beings, or even a law of karma, as in the Eastern traditions, right? But modern naturalism says all that stuff's out too.
Yeah, that's one thing we didn't bring up, is that Socrates and Euthyphro also shift from talking about good and piety to talking about justice. So piety is directed towards the gods, whereas justice is something that gods also participate in. And we didn't really bring up justice today, but that is a little bit of a different concept from good. And I think the word good itself would have to be defined to make the Euthyphro circle meaningful. So we keep saying this is good because of the gods, or the gods say it's good because it is good. But we need to give a definition of what is good. And the answer that it's because the gods desire it is the emotivist answer. Something's good because I desire it. I think that's what keeps the Euthyphro circle going. But if we give either an intellectual or a voluntarist definition of the good, then we don't have that same dilemma.
I have a quick question for you guys, and the question would be, if you take God and the human condition out of context, what does it mean to be good, bad, right, wrong? So if you take our moral standards from what we've constructed based off of God or a deity, what would that mean and what would that involve?
I'm not sure the question makes sense, at least from a Christian theistic perspective, when you to say, let's just remove God and see what stays the same. From a Christian theistic perspective, you remove God and everything collapses, everything changes. And I think that's where Dr. Anderson was getting at, that there is a connection between what we believe metaphysically and what we believe about the good or about value. So I'm not sure if you want to maybe tease out a little more what the question, what you're asking about.
Such as in Christianity, you have the Ten Commandments, which is where most of man has gotten their laws and have built their laws upon. However, my question would be, if God never gave commandments of what is morally right and morally wrong by his standards, and we didn't construct our what is right and wrong by his standards, then what would define good and evil, right, wrong, good, bad?
Yeah, I think your question is interesting because it raises the issue of what's called moral ontology versus moral epistemology. And so you're asking, what if God had not revealed? This is a knowledge issue. What if he hadn't spoken to us, thou shalt, not kill. I still believe those things are revealed in us in terms of our conscience. You know, I think we have in the Ten Commandments a special revelation where God speaks those words in that particular context, writes them, even. And so, but that's different. You know, so let's say he hadn't spoken, but the act of I'd love to hear Dr. Anderson on this. I think the act of creation itself puts in that creation the form of the good. And so we especially for us, it's created in his image. The moral law is created in us. And so I think our conscience bears witness against us. So I think there is a revelation simply by virtue of being created. And so it's not, now God does give those, reiterate some of those commandments, and he gives other commandments that are sometimes specifically for just specific sets of circumstances. Like you read through the Torah, and there's some unique laws that we say, what's going on there? I think that was for specific time frames and for specific cultural contexts. But the moral law, I think, is still revealed in us and not just to us. So I think the ontology is still there. So even if he didn't speak on Mount Sinai, let's say, I think it's still spoken in us in the act of creation.
Okay. Let me just, is this working? Yeah. So, Nicole, that's a very good question. And the reason why it's a good question is because here's what you're saying. There may be a whole range of cases where there is no explicit command, and yet we do have judgments of right and wrong. So if we do have right and wrong, good or bad, but there's no explicit commands, then how would the divine command theory deal with those cases? Where the goodness and the badness of these cases come from, what are they based on? It's not merely how do we know what is right, it's what are those things based on if they are not based on divine command. Now, Richard offers a distinction between explicit and implicit revelation. Explicit revelation is in terms of the commands, and implicit revelation is supposed to take care of these other things, the ones you were inquiring. The only problem that we have about such a move is that there may be radical disagreements between people, both of which might claim, I have an implicit revelation, but my judgment is that this is bad, whereas my judgment is this is good. Which one is right? If the implicit revelation is clear, there should be a reasonable agreement here. But so that's why I think that your question is very good and puts quite a lot of pressure. I think Thomas raised this issue earlier, you touched upon this a little bit, I think.
Which particular?
That how do we distinguish between fake and real people who claim that these are the commandments?
Right. Yeah, that's a point I brought up from Hobbes' Leviathan, where he, well, in all fairness, Hobbes was of the atheist persuasion, but in the passage where he talks about this, book 1, chapter 12 of Leviathan on religion, he mentions the natural propensity of supernatural thinking, and then goes on to say that, well, what if someone abuses that, claims that, he gives us specific historical examples, but that raised the genuine question of, well, how do you know? If you are told that, well, that this is what God told me, how can you verify that?
Yeah, and I should mention here that I was reading this whole topic raised my interest, and I read a few articles, and it turns out that there is this biblical scholar. I didn't know about him. I don't know what he writes, but apparently from secondary sources referring to him, he claims that there were actually deliberate changes made by people who copied the biblical sources throughout the years in order to tilt them to various different directions. Now, how reliable these claims are, I don't know, but apparently this person has a fairly good reputation.
Old Testament, New Testament, what
I think both, but yeah, I think it's also at least New Testament, because in one example that was given in the essay, and I should be looking it up, but I didn't have time. I think his name may be Smith or something like that. I forgot his name. Anyway, he gives an example where a leopard asks Jesus to cure him. Bart Ehrman, exactly. You're right. Thank you so much. His name is Bart Ehrman. E-H-R-M-A-N. Bart. And there he gives the example that there are some indication that the original was written that Jesus got angry. And then there are some other translations or versions where they change it to Jesus is compassionate, and so clearly, because of a clear conflict between these two versions, he thinks that it was simply changed in order to accommodate more Jesus' personality, or the sort of like the portrayal that was. So this is in line with your point and an extension of your question.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman, if you actually read his work, he likes to have these controversial titles, but you actually read the works. He's going to argue that the vast majority of the New Testament is textually reliable. We can know what it says. His mentor, Bart Ehrman, is actually one of my tribe. You know, he was a conservative evangelical, apostatized. He went to all the conservative evangelical institutions, Moody, Bible Institute, Wheaton. Went on to Princeton Theological Seminary, studied under Bruce Metzger at Princeton University. Bruce Metzger is probably North America's premier New Testament textual critic in terms of the textual reliability of the Greek texts that underlie our English translations of the New Testament. So he did 3 versions of his book on the textual reliability of the New Testament. The 4th version was done by Metzger and Ehrman together, and there's no major changes. There's been no major manuscripts that are found that somehow show the textual unreliability. That word in particular, there's been some interesting talk about that. You know, it has to go to, sometimes when a scribe is looking at a text over time, sometimes there are different mistakes that are made. There are mistakes that enter in, and there are what's called variants. If you have a Greek New Testament, which I have one at home, many of the list the variants at the bottom. But sometimes it's very easy to figure out which variants, and you can actually measure, okay, where did this variant come into the textual stream in history? So textual critics say we can be reasonably confident, fairly strongly confident, about what the underlying basis of that text is. So if that's the concern, well, how do we know that what I have today in my New Testament text is what was written by Matthew or Mark? I mean, the scholarship that looks at that is very confident that we know what was originally written. Even though there are variants, we can trace when they came in because of all the manuscript evidence. There's just an abundance of manuscript evidence. So, if you want to look at Bart Ehrman, I would encourage you to read or look at the YouTube debates between him and a competent New Testament critic as well, Dan Wallace, because he's going to be the guy. I think out of that debate you'll see, the reliability of the New Testament text is firm and secure.
The last question would be, if you, being a Christian myself, we take God as being a perfect, take God as being a perfect individual or a perfect being. Some people say because of Jesus, he was both man and God. However, it's either human beings by themselves can be flawed or they can't be. If Jesus was a human being, whether he was part God or whatnot, he would also have to be subject to being flawed himself. And being flawed, doesn't that mean but the Bible, because of its interpretation and because we weren't there ourselves and we don't understand the literal meaning of the Word of God, that it would be very hard to understand and comprehend what he literally was trying to tell us? I mean, we can allude to the fact of, yes, morally right, wrong, good, bad, thou shalt not kill, steal, things like that. But what his literal interpretation was interpreted by the only people who spoke the language at that time was Romans, and therefore had their own political agenda and influences that they wanted to get across. How do we know what is really being written was really transcribed by him, and whether or not he truly was flawed or unflawed? That's my last question. Thank you.
briefly, I'm still thinking about the previous question. I didn't get a way in. But especially about Thomas Hobbes, I think what Hobbes is doing for us is pointing out the epistemology problem. So the epistemology problem is, how do we know if there is a prophet, or if it's a true or false prophet? Now that, just asking the question doesn't necessarily close the door to there being true prophets. There might be actual prophets. They might all be charlatans. But those are two separate questions, right? So how do we know? And then what does a prophet do? And I think that's we've been talking about value and ethics, the good, and then somewhat about relating that to being, which is ontology. But this is the third area, which is knowledge. How do we know what is good or what exists? And so I think that relates to this question too about scriptures. The question itself pushes us in a certain direction to say, are there scriptures? Are there accurate scriptures? How do we know the original meaning of the words being used? How do we know if they relate to our words today? There might be the case that we don't need scriptures at all. Part of what Euthyphro and Socrates are doing is they're not appealing to a text. And even when they do talk about the gods, they don't cite a chapter and verse of the Iliad or something. Part of the idea is that because we are rational beings, we can know that things have natures and things are beneficial or good or help something flourish. So it's not really a question about Scripture at all yet in that sense. That would take us kind of far afield, because Scripture presupposes a number of these things. It presupposes there is a God, there is something good, there is sin, human needs redemption. And I think part of why Peter is bringing this subject up is precisely because it gets to the heart of those questions. Before we can even build up to that, we have to first know what is good, what is God. And so then that's an epistemology question, really, right? How do we know these sorts of things? I think that would keep coming up for us. How do we gain knowledge? How do we have certainty versus just an opinion?
Just briefly to follow up on my point about Hobbes. Hobbes was explicit in that his account applied to the Gentile religions. He excused the one true religion from these considerations. People didn't buy him.
I'll just pick up on a couple things. The last question asked actually about two different things there, about Jesus if being fully God and fully man. That is the Orthodox understanding, that he is fully God, fully man. And so, but the question is, well, since he has a human nature added to his divine nature, does that mean of necessity that human nature must be sinful? And the answer is no, not of necessity. And so just in terms of what the New Testament teaches, Jesus was without sin, so his human nature was not sinful. It was capable of being put to death. I mean, it was frail. He entered into the frailty of our world, and so in that sense. So the second issue, though, you mentioned was how do we know what Jesus taught, which is a separate issue. And I think the fact of the matter is that the earliest disciples listened to him, knew what he taught, and that's why the Gospels that we have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are earliest sources for Jesus. And so that's why somebody will say, well, there's other documents, there's other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and they'll mention all these others. But those all come about in the 2nd century or much later. There was a document recently found, and people were saying, oh, it's in the 2nd century. No, it's in the 5th. Or the Gospel of Judas, which has nothing to do with Jesus. These are all later writings that were not attached to the apostolic band. And so how do we know that we're getting the good stuff? Because these are the earliest documents that we have that talk about Jesus by some of his immediate followers that were right there.
Okay, so my kind of question / kind of argument against of assuming that, like under the definition that we kind of discussed, that God is good, saying that God is good because of what he produces is also good. My kind of argument to that is then how is it possible that things that are considered evil can exist if God is considered good and what he does is good? So either that means that, seeing as it's usually and universally understood that God created everything, if evil exists, then that would mean that God also created that, or it means that evil existed independently of God, then didn't create everything. So, kind of, what's your ideas on that?
Are you asking why the all-good God created a world with evil in it, essentially?
Yeah, either why would an all-good God create, pretty much why would an all-good God create a world with evil in it if he is good?
Okay. I'll just riff on it a second. I wrote my dissertation on this, for what it's worth. It has been cited once,
The answer to
maybe
that
twice.
question is $49.95. You can see us afterwards, and we'll be happy to tell you why there's evil.
I actually, the whole purpose of my dissertation was to just end this thing for all and just establish atheism and be done with it. I failed at that. I did argue in my dissertation that the evil in the world is evidence against God's existence, but I argued that it's not conclusive. I think probably, this is just one guy's opinion, but I was really impressed by John Hick's book, Evil and the God of Love, where he suggests that virtues like courage or fortitude, patience, and all kinds of things like that, they simply demand a certain context in which to work. And so the analogy that I think when I read John Hick's book, it makes me think of video games. Okay, so you get this video game, and the first time you play it, you're not going to put it on God mode, because in God mode you have unlimited health and unlimited ammo, and the game isn't any fun. So you intentionally play it with a challenge. You'll play God mode maybe the fourth time you play it. I'll do that. I do play some video games on occasion. But I never want to play God mode first of all. So I think that the suffering of the game has to have the right amount of challenge in it in order to be worth playing for me. And if there's no challenge, I don't even want to play it. So when I think about and I do believe in a supreme creator being, why did that being create this world with so much mess in it? The best answer that I've found is that it's a place for virtue building and a place for growth. It really isn't desirable to be created perfect. It's better to work your way to perfection. Now, of course, I know that there are situations in which you might be a child and might die before you get a chance to develop virtues and so on. That's why I personally, I have a sort of a hybrid position where I believe in an afterlife and I also believe in levels there. So you got the Hindus have their reincarnation doctrine where you come back here. And then the Abrahamics have this final day of judgment deal where everything happens there. And I have this hybrid position, which is a little bit more like Hicks, where there is a there, but there's also a movement like the Hindus would talk about. It's a kind of a synthesis that I hope is not just some sort of lazy eclecticism, but it makes some sense out of what I'm perceiving in the world. But I think that John Hick's book, Evil and the God of Love, is an incredibly powerful response to the atheist argument. Although I do think that evil is evidence against God's existence, I do agree with the atheists on that one. I just don't think it's conclusive. That's what I would say on that.
Okay. I did have a quick comment on, were you saying that you did believe that perfection is something that can be attained, like something that can be worked up to?
I do personally believe that the goal of the human soul, and I do believe in souls, is to rise in perfection and ever increasing perfection as close and close as possible to the Supreme Being. Get as close to the Supreme Being as possible according to our nature.
Okay.
I'll just add one more thing. Anytime a problem of evil comes up, it's a big one, right? There's a lot of different perspectives, but many times the question is asked, and I think you, in the process of asking your question, you use this phrase, like, why did God create evil? And I don't know, it's not like evil's a substance. I mean, he created trees, he created people, he created dogs and lakes, he created, these kinds of things. But I don't know if evil is like a thing like that. We tend to think that. And so there's actually been people who have talked about in the history of philosophy, of a privation theory, that it's the absence of the good. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think of evil is also a relational category. It says, as we are out of sorts with our Creator, in rebellion against Him, this is an evil state that we find ourselves in. And so I think, why would God allow that? Well, I think there's different kinds of, there's a soul-making theodicy, which is Hicks. There's also what's called a greater good defense, that God is going to bring some greater good out of this evil. It's not that evil becomes good because it's part of the process. It's inherently evil or inherently bad, but it's instrumentally good. It's used instrumentally for a good end. And we start asking, well, what might those ends be? And I think this is where scriptural revelation helps us as a Christian. We start looking at, And I think many times Christians forget to look at our foundational texts. What are God's goals? Well, part of his goals are not just to maximize human happiness. That's not a Christian answer. That might be some other gods, version of God. But that's not, God is manifesting the glory of his character because that is the ultimate good. And he manifests that supremely by doing something amazing, by sending his son Jesus Christ both to the incarnation, the enfleshment of God himself amongst us, and his death and resurrection. Those are such positive, powerful goods. Alvin Plantinga, as an analytical philosopher, recently talked about these two categories and said, any world that is actualized, that has this, an incarnation of the Son of God and the death of the Son of God for people, is a greater good world. And so he articulates that argument. I can give you the resources to look at his writing if you want, but I think as a Christian, I'm looking at God's purposes centered in Jesus Christ. He's manifesting something there and uses evil instrumentally and actually brings good out of it. And that's at least one perspective to consider.
Okay, so looking at the horn from the arbitrariness of it, the way I'm imagining it is that when God created the universe, he called it good. When he created the planet, he called it good. When he created the animals, he called it good. And in my perspective, I feel as though in that terms of goodness is equivalent to necessity. So God is good in the fact that he's necessary. So in that, we find that, like, if he was to build a house, we have 4 points that hold up the roof, that they are necessary. It may seem arbitrary to some foreigner why we have 4 points, but to us, we see the necessity of it. And that in our bodies, we stand on 2 legs, and you can look at the science of why we stand on 2 legs and the benefit of it. And it's necessary for us to be humans and to walk on 2 legs, but to another creature it may seem arbitrary. And I feel as though if the physical realm was created by God and is necessary, then, and if God created it, he also created the metaphysical world or morality, and the necessity of it is, for example, do not murder. Like, we can all explain why that's a necessity, but if you go into a place where people don't recognize that, you have chaos where neighbor kills neighbor and you can't trust anybody and nobody wants to live there. And I feel as though that if you abandon the necessity of it, you're drawing further away from God. And like, you can look at Aristotelian ethics, of virtues, that you can say those are the necessities that we strive to follow in God, like, courage, wisdom, kindness, that in the absence of that is sin or evil. Like, as you guys brought up, like killing babies, torturing babies is evil. And I feel like the raw evilness of it comes from the sheer unnecessity of it. Like, why would you need to kill a baby? There's no reason for that. And kind of, I forgot who brought it up, but the fact where they scanned the person's brain and saw the positive reaction from them, I feel as though that's a physical, scientific reaction to that person, that spiritually they understand the good and evil, but their body is having a physical reaction as well. You can draw it to the Christian Trinity, where God is God, the Holy Spirit is morality, and we are the Son. I just want to know what you think about that.
Before we comment on this, could you kind of articulate a little bit what do you mean by necessity? Because there are several concepts of necessity. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 is necessary. That's not what you mean. Do you mean instrumental necessity? In other words, it's somehow instrumentally good for us, given our nature, to walk on 2 legs. Is that what you mean?
Like, it gave us benefit over animals that didn't walk.
Gives us benefit, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by instrumental. Is certain condition is instrumental to certain benefit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the fact that we walk on 2 legs, like 2 + 2 equals the benefit over other animals.
Well, the 2 + 2 = 4 necessity is a mathematical necessity. That's what I wanted to distinguish between simply mathematical necessity, which belongs to one area, but you have in mind simply instrumental. This condition is necessary to bring about this benefit, right? That's what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Because, of course, the response to that would be, but is this benefit good? And that now brings back the whole Euthyphro all over again. Is God creating us with this kind of condition to bring about this benefit good? Or does God did that, create us in that way because this benefit is good? And we got the same problem.
I was just going to mention in terms of, when I heard you say necessary, that, it's necessary we have two legs, I'm like, well, no, it's not. And philosophers sometimes talk about possible worlds. And so if something is true and has to be true in every possible world, they sometimes call that a necessary truth. But there's a possible world in which God created humans like with 3 arms, right? We can play with that. There's nothing necessary that God has to have us have just 2 arms and have us sort of have this symmetrical, body plan to us. And so that's what I think Peter was getting at. It's instrumentally good, but not necessarily good. So when you say necessary amongst professional philosophers like these guys are, they're going to start thinking those categories.
Yeah.
And you mentioned God created morality. What's your religious background, if you don't mind me asking?
Roman Catholic.
Okay, so I thought you were within the Christian tradition. So, I was going to just help say, hey, as a fellow Christian, we want to word these things maybe a little differently. Morality is not so much created; it's actually an expression of God's nature, which is necessary in that in that sense. And so those would be just some distinctions I would make.
Thank you.
But we have to be careful about nature, as I try to point out. To say that God's nature is good is fine. But now we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? And we then very quickly face the Euthyphro dilemma, either because what we mean is that God's nature includes certain characteristics or traits that are good independently of God, in which case we're going to face one horn of the dilemma, or we say that the reason why these are good is because God has them. But now we have to explain why God having these traits makes them good. And we can't say, well, because God is good, because this is exactly what we're trying to unpack now. So that would be begging the question. Why God having these traits of lovingness and caringness and all that makes these traits good? And it can't be because God is good, because that's exactly what we're trying to explain. So we are caught in that thing. That's why I said nature here is it faces directly Euthyphro dilemma.
Let me add a couple of things, because you mentioned something that touches on my topic on societies. Yes, most all societies have rules against murder, because murder is defined as unlawful killing. However, if you look at just the current world, you find different societies, and there seems to be a lot of interpretation of when killing is unlawful. You have a lot of societies that still have capital punishment. That's considered lawful killing. Abortion is legal in various jurisdictions. Again, that's not considered murder. Well, depending on your stance on it, you may consider it murder. But from a societal perspective, it is legal. Euthanasia, and so on. And a little bit of a historical background. You mentioned killing babies as a paradigm instance of an evil action. Funny thing, because in the Book of Republic, so in Plato's time, he mentions letting babies die from exposure. He doesn't argue for it at all. He just casually brings up the point, which suggests to me that that was widely accepted practice at the time. So kind of postnatal form of abortion. So even those things are not universal. Peter Singer would be another instance there.
One thing that your question made me think about in this issue of necessity, and I was thinking the same thing about instrumental necessity or virtue, that something is useful for some goal. And this raises the question, there are different levels of goals, like building a house, and you talked about the four corners of the house to hold up the roof, and you build a house to stay out of the weather, and you want to stay out of the weather so you can be healthy and more productive. And so there are different levels of goals that come up in life. And that raises the question if there's a highest goal, and this is called in the literature the good. And so we've talked about the good in one way here, which is constrained by the Euthyphro discussion. And again, that discussion is an emotivist view of the good, which is something's good if it is desirable or it appeals to me. But another way of discussing the same term, the good, so it's the same word, but it's ambiguous, is that it's the highest goal. So you are aiming at this thing as an end in itself, not to get something else, and you may not even desire it on some days, but it's the highest goal, the end in itself, the good, the chief end of man. And so then you can use the language you're using, ask this question, what is this thing? What is the highest goal? Now in my presentation, that was one of the things I was getting at, was that for humans, the highest goal is to know things, and not just anything, like how many times have the Red Sox won the World Series, but to know the highest being, and be able to know the details about the highest being, not just general kind of highest power. And so that's one of the things I think is highlighted by this whole dilemma is the word good. I tried to zero in on how the word God is used ambiguously in different worldviews, but also we've been using the word good ambiguously and tending to slip into the way Euthyphro was using it, which is that it's that which is desirable. And then you get these problems. It doesn't come up the same way, the same issue if you're speaking about ends. And you could just stop using the word good and just talk about, what is your goal or end, and what is the highest end? What is the chief end? And I think the other thing about the Euthyphro dilemma is that there are different kinds of dilemmas in philosophy. Some dilemmas are both options lead to falsehoods. And so the starting point must also be false. And that's often what we do, like when we're going on the offensive against another worldview, we'll point out, well, if you believe this, you lead to this false conclusion. And if you go this direction, you lead to that false conclusion. So you can't start down this direction at all. But the Euthyphro dilemma, as we've been presenting, is a little different, isn't it? We've been presenting it more like, here are two things, both of which have some problems, but neither of which is necessarily false. So Mike defended the fact that you do simply have brute facts about morality, and it may be fine to stop with God and say God is the origin of these things. But that's not quite the same as, someone could object to that and say, I'm not comfortable with that stopping point, but that's not quite the same as saying that's a false horn of dilemma. It's just two horns, and people maybe are uncomfortable with one or the other. And part of what I was talking about is the reasons why we're uncomfortable illustrate things about ourselves and our own prior commitments. So if I'm uncomfortable with stopping with God, or I'm uncomfortable with what seems to be arbitrary, that's an interesting thing. It kind of shows some of my own commitments. Why am I uncomfortable? What are my intuitions? And that's what philosophy does, right? Philosophy encourages us to lead the examined life, to get to know ourselves and what are my own beliefs, and why do I end up thinking this horn of the dilemma is less acceptable. I don't like the arbitrary side. I like the God as the foundational brute fact side. That's what's so interesting to me, what that says about us.
So, about dilemmas and their character. I mean, Owen is right. There are dilemmas such that no matter which way you go, you're going to end up with false, with a falsity. For example, there are no universal truths. Whether it's true, if it's true, then it's false, and if it's false, it's false. So no matter what, it's going to be false. The Euthyphro dilemma is not the same, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the same force. And here's what I mean. Euthyphro dilemma is situated within a certain background set of beliefs. And the force of the dilemma is, together with those beliefs, you're going to lead, no matter which horn, you're going to lead to a problem. So together with the theistic belief that everything depends on God, there can't be anything out of God's control, one horn that leads to moral standards being independent from God contradicts that idea. The second horn contradicts the idea that the moral right and wrong is not arbitrary, not just anything could be right. Like, for example, being cruel cannot be right. But if the arbitrariness horn is correct, then that will conflict with that theistic view. So Owen is right that it doesn't exhibit the same sharp
as some other dilemmas, like the one I just mentioned. There are no universal truths. That will directly lead to it's always false. But together with some other set of reasonable beliefs, it appears to lead to some serious problems. And in that sense, it's a dilemma too.
All right, so I need some clarification before I can actually ask my question. And that question, or the sub-question to that would be, what is God? And Professor Lupu, he gave us an idea of properties and characteristics rather than a being as the rest of them did. So like on a level, like are we going to refer to him as a being or a set of properties?
Okay, so what I did was connect Euthyphro dilemma to a whole separate debate. There's a debate within theology, the study of monotheistic God, that is labeled the personalist conception of God versus the transcendent conception of God. And so what I claimed, and the personalist conception of God is that God is a person-like being but with maximal desirable properties. So for example, God is all-knowing. Knowledge is desirable. God will be maximally knowing. No. Having power is desirable. God will be maximally powerful. That is one conception. And the other conception is that God is not a person-like being, is not a being like any other being, an individual thing with characteristics, but rather the status of God is a whole different kind of existence. And I wanted to argue that Euthyphro dilemma is an argument against a person like God.
Okay. So then if we're all, like my question, that clarified whether if we are a manifestation of God or if we were created in his image. So I'm going to go with that we were created in his image, so therefore we inherently have his characteristics or the yearning for infinite knowledge and those. But God also has some immoral things that we would say about him. You know, he's very wrathful. Would that mean it's morally just since we're his image for us to be wrathful? Does it give us the moral confirmation that we can rain down plagues upon other people because it's an instrument for the greater good? Is that morally justifiable since we are an image of God?
Your question makes no sense to what Peter said. Right? Yeah. Yeah, because I just want to make, so if you were working off of his definition of God, he wouldn't say that humanity is created in his image.
No, the other one.
Okay, no, I would, yeah.
He's not a set of properties, so we're created of his image. If he was a set of properties, then we would be a manifestation, but we're an image, so yeah.
Yeah, we are created in his image. I would argue Christian theism says that God is both transcendent and personal. And I think one of the issues, and we've talked about this over coffee, Peter and I, that whence arises human personality, consciousness. You know, if you have this impersonal, transcendent source, how do you get personal consciousness that seems to be a value, but seems to be a value above the transcendent source? I would argue that in biblical theism, God is both transcendent and personal. Anselm talked about the most maximally perfect being, sort of perfect being theology. In regards to, yes, God is wrathful. He expresses wrath, which is actually a form of love because he loves justice, and that those things that oppose justice bring forth wrath. So is it appropriate that we as humans have wrath? I hope so. I hope when we hear about, I mean, what is this month? Hashtag Me Too, right? You know what that is? No, that's not funny. I mean, that's a reality out there. I mean, I hope that we are wrathful, that we experience a moral revulsion at the sexual abuse of whoever, men, women, and so I think wrath is an appropriate category. Now we have to get how is it expressed or who gets to express. Does God have unique prerogatives to express his wrath? Well, of course. He's a necessary being. He's created us. You have to understand, God is not like an object. We're talking about him like he's just one other object in the room. Like, you have that friend maybe you're going to talk about like behind their back, but he's like right there. Well, let's just pretend like he's not here and we're talking about him. That's what we're doing. I mean, he's here with us, according to Christian theism, right? He's not like the chair or the tree out there. He's what's upholding every molecule, every breath we're taking right now as we're talking about, I'm not sure if you're allowed to do that. It's like, well, thank you, instead of saying thank you for doing that. And so he has prerogatives that we don't as the creator, as the upholder of all things.
Does that mean that, I guess it would lead into relativism. What happens if a society is like, they have more just, we don't condemn homosexuals here, but then in the Middle East they do. So is it our moral duty to push upon the view that that they have immoral views, and would our wrath be justifiable because I guess they're more immoral, even though we're committing we're using immoral instruments to combat just their immoral basis? I don't know how to word it.
Let me just try to explicate and see whether this is a question you're asking. Are you asking the following? So there are standards in some other culture, and there are standards here. And if they conflict, are you asking whether we can be judgmental or harshly criticize that other cultural standards? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, but then also being allowed to, force them out of that. Like God.
And coerce them to change.
Yes.
In light
Yes.
of what we think. And I'm assuming that will lead to the question that Richard previously the difference that he articulated regarding the revealed or explicit revelation and implicit revelation, would that be something that you would?
Well, obviously different cultures manifest different values. And I would say that some of them are right, some of them are wrong. How the right or wrong is going to be, are they a reflection of God's character? So the issue is, well, it's a separate issue from, so we want to avoid cultural relativism that Mike brought up. It's a separate issue. Now, what do we do with that? Well, should we coerce them? Well, sometimes. And we've done that. And I think most people would look at that. The Nuremberg trials, there was some coercion involved upon those states, because they're engaged in what they were engaged in, the massive genocide of millions of people. We brought some coercion to bear. And we might then debate, and I think there might be plausible debates as to, what mechanisms of coercion or how far that coercion should extend and to what. Now, we can debate those things, but those are separate issues. And I think people that are sort of on the same team in terms of moral realism, even if they have the same worldview, there may still be disagreements as about what mechanisms and to what extent we might do those things. But yeah, I would say yes to something. I think we'd recognize that in some cases, yes.
Okay, and to follow up that, because the point you raised in your question that if we are in our society, we accept certain behaviors, other societies do not. That's actually the opposite of cultural relativism, because according to the guidelines of cultural relativism, we would say that, oh, we do it this way, they do it their way, it's all cool. The fact that we criticize other societies for their practices is indicative that we think there is this universal standard according to which we can say that, hey, wait a minute, that's not allowed.
One of the things Richard mentioned the Nuremberg trials, one of the things that came out of those trials, which were the Allies holding the Nazis responsible for what had happened, was that in the 20th century, up until then, positive law had been the major legal theory, which is that something is legal or illegal depending on if your local legislature has made it so. But then if that's the case, and I think this applies directly to the Euthyphro dilemma, because if that's the case, then there's no basis for which to try Nazis for anything, because they didn't break British law, or they didn't break German law, they broke British and American law, right? And they weren't under the jurisdiction of British and American law. So on what basis are you going to hold them accountable? And so one of the outcomes of this was that the 20th century took a turn after this, like the midpoint of the 20th century, back to the idea of natural law to say there's some things that are legal or not legal, right or wrong, good or evil, independent of what the local society says. And that's why we're able to hold them accountable after the war. And that's the basis for having United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and things like that, is that, there are some things which are true about morality, and it doesn't depend on whether or not a legislator has said they're true.
I would like also to point out a distinction that is very important anytime we talk about what Richard called moral realism or objective morality. Very frequently there is a conflation of objectivity with dogmatism. And people object to objective morality because they object to dogmatism and they think it's the same thing. But that's false. Dogmatism is an attitude toward objective truths. It is the attitude that there are objective truths, objective moral truths, and I know them. So anybody, and I know, by know I mean I know for certain. And so anybody who disagrees with me automatically is wrong. That's dogmatism. But somebody can believe in objective moral truths, have very strong opinions about some of those, but at the same time may concede that there is a chance that they are wrong. And therefore there is further place for inquiry. So there is this difference between the two, and you may, or somebody may, object to dogmatic attitudes, but at the same time accept that there are objective moral truths.
So it's only opinion. You can't have knowledge of moral facts?
Oh, you can have knowledge, but knowledge is not certainty.
Right, that's fine. I mean, at
Yeah.
one level. But it's more just the attitude and the way it's held, I think, is what you're getting at.
Well, that you can claim knowledge, but whether you have knowledge requires a process, looking at new cases,
Warranted,
like,
justified belief.
and moreover, like in science, for example. In science, you can have knowledge, but you have claims for knowledge. You have sort of strong evidence for certain things, but you can never say that any challenge to the prevailing theory must be automatically false.
There should be other options, though, right? Besides those, like in science, especially, it's operating under a kind of revisionist view. So, once the scientists, they might say they know certain things, but once you press them back, they'll say, "Okay, we don't. It's a good theory. It's the best we've got." But they wouldn't claim to have certainty because of what Richard just said, which is there's also this connection, we think, right, between knowledge and certainty. So that when we say we know something, we mean I have a true belief and I can prove that it's true. And if either one of those is not the case, then I don't really know it. Right, so that'd be, I think we got next year's panel discussion, right, of does knowledge and certainty, do these go together? Because then I think this attitude that you're mentioning is partly why Socrates started the Euthyphro discussion. Because this guy comes in and sits down, a young guy, and he's very arrogant, and he believes he's pious, and he's doing what God commanded him to do. And Socrates doesn't like this attitude at all, right, which is what you're getting at as well. And asks, just with a couple questions, you can pretty quickly see this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know if God does command things or not, let alone if he's pious. So I think that attitude you're getting at is probably something all philosophers have a disdain for, right? Begin going back to Socrates, which is the claim to know and you don't have any proof, or your proof is flawed, as opposed to if you did have knowledge, then you'd have certainty, right?
Yeah, but again, this opens up an issue about whether the domain of religious theism is what kind of relationship do we have to it? Is it a relationship of faith, for example, that we just simply accept it as a belief, we don't need any proof? Is that the right attitude? Is the right attitude inquiry? And then if it's inquiry, what kind of inquiry? Are we, and so I don't know if you have gathered, I'm not opposed to the conception of God. I'm opposed to a personalized conception of God. But this is up for inquiry to me. And the question is, okay,
What is the methodology? What kind of method do we have? We are lucky, or maybe very unlucky, that we got a good method in what we call science, in those physics department, chemistry department, whatever they are. They have a good method. Is that good for us or not? Remains to be seen. What kind of method do we have in the case of religion, in the case of discovering this realm that religion talks about? Or what kind of method we have about morality, this area where we say things are good or bad, but what would be the basis for it? So I think that this is an open question. And that's why I say that certain attitudes, if you take a dogmatic attitude towards these things, that's one thing. But you can also say there's objective truths about this realm, the religious realm. But it's open to inquiry. We don't know what is the truth about it. And if we say that, for example, we have evidence from some books, even if you grant a lot, still you're going to have to take a position, is it inerrant or is it revelation? And if it's revelation, which part is the revelation and which part is the background sort of fluff? These decisions have to be made. So I think that what I'm calling for is to say, what is the method of inquiry in this area? By the way, this question also arises about the social sciences, like psychology, for example. That is a comment to him. Marcos, how you doing? Okay, and next one.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys for your time today.
Thank you for coming.
Hi. I feel like in a communion back in Catholicism. All this line. And you guys are Jesus in the middle.
I know him.
I'm just kidding. The prophet. My question. Sorry. My question is, what if God comes from morality and morality comes from man? Or rather, what if God comes from morality and morality comes from the man who is in power? Or also the weak man, or the weak man, which is like, could be the slave, like the Jews under the Egyptians. And therefore, God is the place of power, and God is the place where power is played. That's the question.
So are you asking, what if the conception of God comes from our conception of morality, and the conception of morality comes from humans?
That we are the ones who invented it, yes.
So
we
the
are
idea
like
would be,
demiurges.
what if it were the case that we invented morality, and then
Yeah.
from morality we invented the concept of God?
Yeah. That's it.
Well, that would certainly be one atheistic perspective. I do believe that there is a supreme being, and I do believe that the supreme being is the place of power. That human beings frequently misuse the supreme being to get what they want, in my opinion, is no evidence at all that there isn't actually a supreme being. I just think people have the freedom of the will to be manipulative. I still think there's a supreme being, even if it's the case that many people misuse the concept for their own personal gain. But that's just my personal view.
But sorry, isn't it more religious, it's the opposite of atheism, thinking in this way? Because you're the one who creates, so you are your own demiurge.
Whoa. Well, I do have some kind of a conception of God, but the way you phrased your question suggested that perhaps humans created God rather than God creating humans.
Right.
I think God created
Sorry.
conditions.
Well, if we
for
didn't
humans.
exist, would God exist? The idea of God would
Oh, if
not
we didn't
maybe
exist, would God exist?
Yeah, that's...
I would say absolutely, yeah. Now, maybe you wouldn't have humans walking around with the concept of God, but there would still be an objective reality of the supreme being there. That's what my view would be. In other words, if humans actually create a God and God really exists because we created that God, then I would say that God has even less power than we have. Because that God would owe its existence to us. Right. So I wouldn't consider that God to be especially impressive.
I did see that one of the Silicon Valley titans is starting an AI religion on some kind of computer he and his friends have made. And I had the same thought that you did, which was, this is either going to go very bad like Skynet, or it's kind of a pathetic thing like Siri. Doesn't do that much, really. But either way, you're going to do a religion, and what is this? I mean, the best thing, I'm hoping what they'll do is maybe also have a kind of capitalist-driven AI religion, where the way they'll get numbers is by saying you only have to tithe 9.3% at our religion. The guys down the road, they want 10%, and then you can start opening different campuses that undercut each other. Well, we're the 8.2% religion, and save money that way. But yeah, precisely. Yeah. Well, that's what these guys are. I presume these are atheists that are starting this. But I think the conceptual mistake that's going on is the difference between humans thinking about something and then them having created it. Those are two different things. So, for example, I might think about mathematics and write a book about how 2 + 2 is 4, and it's the first book ever about that. But those things were there before I thought about them. Right? They existed. There were 2 things over here and 2 things over here, and combining them made 4 things. So I think that's what Mike is getting at, that God would still exist independent if humans were thinking about God. But it is important. The philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach taught about how man does make God in his image. And so this question does get to something we could call conceptual idolatry, which is that although we don't necessarily have statues around very often anymore of gods, we do have idols in that we misconceive of God and we make God after our own image instead of the other way around. I think Mark Twain joked one time and he said, "I know I'm made in the image of God because people often confuse us." But the idea is the same, which is that we tend to think of God as a kind of projection of what I'm like. Maybe I recognize a few mistakes of mine, and so I take those out, and then God is basically me on a good day. And that's a conceptual idol, right? So many of, can maybe sort out many of the religions and think about how they're basically just a guy who's very active. He likes to beat up his enemies and drink mead. He likes the ladies. They'll call him Thor, right? And that's just a projection of what the people of that area like to do, as opposed to the creator of the universe. Those are different ideas.
Just to follow up on the point you raised, it echoes the view that Hobbes was presenting, that on religion, that people are naturally superstitious. Those who are in power, they can take advantage of this. How, well, they don't present the thing that, oh, here are the rules I want you to follow. Instead go, here are the rules that I commune with God, and God told me that these are the rules God wants you to follow. And then the justification was that this pacifies the society. When there is strife in society, what are the subjects going to do? This kind of lets the powers that be off the hook. That people are now saying that, oh, we have all this strife in society because we fell short in following God's rules. But then again, Hobbes makes the disclaimer, which not many people believed, that this is just how the Gentiles do it, how the heathens do it. But there is one true religion where it's a genuine message.
But how can you say that? Also making a scripture or stopping asking the questions like the what's, that it's infinite. The questioning is infinite, it's complex, and we make it simple. We make a Bible to have the answers there, to have something truth and to have some order. But how can you say that that has to be something that you should follow? And isn't it better to go beyond those given ready-made answers?
Well,
is it?
Well, some of the rules make perfect sense, and I don't know what it would mean to go beyond them. Like, for example, if someone said you shouldn't murder people, or you shouldn't rape people or steal their stuff, I would say that sounds sensible. I don't know what it would mean to go beyond that. Maybe to go beyond it might mean to come up with further rules that weren't written down in this place, like maybe don't troll people excessively on Facebook when they post or something. You know, that would be like going beyond and getting more specific in new technologies and stuff like that. But since I firmly believe in objective morality, if a religion, now I'm speaking as a deist, but if a religion says something that I think comports with morality, then I say, good for that religion. And then if it says something that I think is all off, then I say, bad for that religion. But ultimately, I am persuaded that my moral judgments that I use to judge religions, because I don't think all religions are equally good or equally bad, I do believe that they are in fact coming from the Supreme Being. And if a religion says the Supreme Being is a big jerk, then I say, well, I think that religion's got the Supreme Being wrong. So I do believe in objective morality and the objective existence of a Supreme Being. And humans can understand only so much. I mean, sometimes we really do need things in a simple, short, easy form that's not overly complicated. Like, don't steal. Two or three words which make perfect sense. And I say, keep it short, keep it simple.
But you can't keep it simple, I think. It's incorrect. You're like being racist towards
Well, most of the time not stealing is entirely simple.
It's, I mean, yeah, but also that's being,
Yeah.
that's closing, that's having a statement closing like a door. Whereas I think it's better to keep them open and opening more doors, having more,
well, I will be happy to steal some stuff, but it'd have to be in a very special circumstance, right?
Yeah, it depends on circumstances.
Most of the time,
like
it's just
all
no.
relative, yeah.
Right, yeah.
There's something I would like to mention because it came up here with your question and then your response. It's like what I call the Freudian Marxist move. Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses, which is essentially the idea that those in power use religion to control the masses. And there is a danger here because what we do then is we very easily can rephrase or rearticulate things about the questions about how the world is to questions about what are the motives for people who claim this is how the world is. So there's a confusion between the truth, is it true or false that there is a God, versus why are you saying there is a God? Are you trying to control me or something like that? Are you?
But
and I want to distinguish, just hold on. I want to distinguish those two things because very frequently when you ask questions about religion, the natural response is, oh, well, that's just a method of controlling people. And that's just, it may be so, but besides, even if it is so, the question is, but is it true? You can also control people by telling them the truth. And say, oh, that was true, okay, now I'm going to do what you say. So we always have to distinguish the motive from the questions of truth and falsity, from the questions of justification, and that goes all the way back to the Greeks.
But the truth and false, can't they stay together?
What do you mean
like
by
just by distinguishing truth and false, already there you're having a faith on distinguishing them.
Well,
right? Like have them, it's against the non-contradiction, right?
Well,
why can we have like God exists and he doesn't exist? Because God now, sorry.
Yeah, the answer to that is, I think ultimately, I see where you're going. The answer to that is ultimately the very nature of thought. The idea of a thought rather than water here moving. Yeah. That the nature of thought is that thoughts are true or false.
Right.
And therefore that brings in questions of justification, rationality, and all that. As opposed to this water moving, that's not true or false. That is just moving or not moving or subject to causes and so forth and so on. So the answer is that I think that if you want to talk about thoughts, then questions of truth and falsity arise. This is not to say that thoughts don't have causes, but if they don't have true falsity and justification and so forth, then they just are physical events that have a cause and have consequences, and that's it.
But isn't there more beauty and beauty on seeing the changes of the things? Or
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
that water.
Yeah. All I'm trying to insist is that there is a difference between questions of truth and falsity of a thought and the motive why a speaker or a group says it.
Right.
And as long as we distinguish those, then we can have good ideas about why people say that, and we can also have an inquiry whether it's true or false. So whether religion is used for manipulating people and controlling them, maybe a sociological, psychological question, but whether claims of religion are true or false has to be a totally different enterprise. That's all I'm saying. Okay, next.
Thank you.
Nicole, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. You go through this every day in class with us.
When you show up?
Yeah, when I show up. It takes me a day or two to come up with questions for you that you may or may not be able to answer. But I have a two-part question. One is, I don't feel my question has been previously answered. I called into question the Bible itself as in the integrity of the document. I call that into question because it was not only translated by the Romans who had their own political influence, but they were translated by humans who had their own influences and or flaws themselves. So how can we today know that the Bible, in and of itself, considering the first council of churches with Emperor Constantine and whatnot when they came about to put the first Bible into production, how did we know that that is an entirely document that we are supposed to follow blindly? That's my first question.
Well, there's just a number of factual errors in what you said. The first council, you mentioned with Constantine, he's around 313 in that area. You already have multiple copies of the New Testament and the documents circulating amongst the church. And it wasn't the Romans. The Romans were eventually beginning to persecute the church. So they're not interested in copying these documents. It's the church, which is primarily at its very beginning a Jewish movement, which is already a textual-based people. They understand what it is to have texts and to keep texts over time. It quickly moves into the Gentile regions, but I think they adopt those same kinds of things. And it's what Christians are some of the first who use the new technology of what's called the codex. Rather than going from the scrolls, this is the first form of books. And so they're the first ones to begin to put things in book form. And so it's not the case that you have that's only later. Sometimes you'll hear this in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, that it was 325, the Council of Nicaea. This is the first time that all the canon of Scripture, the official list of books was, that's just plain false. I mean, early on, already in the early 2nd century with Irenaeus, you have him looking at particularly the 4 Gospels and a number of other books, recognizing them as authoritative. Now, if you look at the history of what's called canon studies as to how, when these books were recognized, I think as the Word of God within the church, there are some books that were disputed along the way, and they're the more shorter ones that probably did not have as wide a distribution initially. So that's why, because the early church was very interested in making sure that their canon had integrity. We're not just throwing anything in there. Oh, you got one you think, oh, let's just put it in. Well, just anything goes. So the fact that they would actually question some that eventually got put in shows, I think, that there was an interest in making sure that the truthfulness, that this message matched up with the original disciples that worked and ministered with Jesus. They heard him speak. Matthew heard Jesus speak. John heard Jesus speak. There's perhaps some even speculated that perhaps Matthew, being a tax collector, he had the ability that would write in his job. He perhaps even kept a journal. We don't know that, but it's not implausible. And so you're getting firsthand sources from the people. Now, the question that I thought you were asking before is, well, how do we know that that text has been transmitted over time correctly? And that's the whole science of textual criticism. And that's when I mentioned those facts about the variants and all those kinds of things that Bart Ehrman and other people look at. But I don't know if that helps. But
that helps. And the other...
Hold on. So we are at 3:35 already. I wanted to mention 2 things. Number one, I think maybe Zach will have the opportunity to ask the last question, but some of the panelists will stay for a while, and so anybody who have questions can come and we can talk to them. But let Zach ask the last question, and then we're going to officially stop it, and then anybody who has questions, can you please come and talk with us?
As long as it's an easy one, like what's our favorite color?
Ask the hardest question you can think about.
That's closer to it. So you kind of discussed earlier how kind of like morals and ideals of that couldn't have just been like a byproduct of like people like evolving and adapting. I'm kind of asking how. So like, why couldn't morals just be like something that humans have as instinct? Like gorillas and elephant seals don't need to be told, thou shalt make a harem. It's instinct for them. Clownfish don't need to be told. It's like, oh, males, when the females die, thou shalt change your sex to take her position. Like, they didn't need to be told something like that, or at least there's not evidence of that. It's just more of instinctual for them to do that. So from at least what I was gathering earlier, some of you were discussing that it's not just something that came across, that humans just inherently had it. And I'm kind of asking like how, or at least why. If that makes sense.
I think the nature of morality, it requires that duties and obligations. And the fact that I think there are instincts within animals, but those aren't duties. Like, I don't think it's a duty, you know, for an animal to do such and such. You know, and so they're not like violating some moral obligation. That's why we say, you know, when a lion, we see that on YouTube, killed a zebra. We're not saying, oh my gosh, he murdered that zebra. He ought not to have done that, right? But when a person does that, we see on YouTube, and you know, we see it for a rally, and some person, you know, goes up and hits somebody behind on the head and kills them, you know, and it's like, no, that was a murder, and we use that as a piece of evidence, as testimony. So I think to conflate, you know, we're more than just instinctual creatures. I think this goes back, you know, to what Dr. Anderson said. What are we as humans? And I think we're more than just animals. I think as creating the image of God, I think we have this moral sense implanted in us. And so I think it can't be explained simply by instinct.
Okay, but even still, there's like inconsistencies in what people consider moral. Like you were even saying, like in the past, casual to bring up just allowing infants to just die by exposure, while as nowadays it's considered different. So there's obviously inconsistencies in what we were told should be correct.
Well, to follow up on that, since I was the one who brought up the point, and one of the earlier questions asked, well, in the United States there is more tolerance towards homosexuality, well, allegedly, than in some other countries in the world. That wasn't always so. In the United States, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder up until early 70s, according to DSM. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that things change over time. What society thinks of certain actions or certain specific actions can evolve over time, but even with these kinds of changes, you can still say that those things would be objectively, that you can say that it's objective morality even if it changes over time.
Okay. Well, thank you for staying so long.
Thank you, Peter, for putting this together. Thank you for putting this together.
Sure. Yep. And anybody who has questions, please come. Don't hesitate to come and harass them.